What exactly does it mean to think? Where are memories stored? In Season 2, Episode 9 of the Dialexicon podcast, I sat down with Caitlin Mace to explore the fascinating intersection of philosophy and neuroscience. Mace is a graduate student in the History and Philosophy of Science department at the University of Pittsburgh and holds a BA in psychology with a minor in ethics as values as well as an MA in philosophy. At Dialexicon, our mission is to bring conversations about philosophy with leading scholars to young audiences. As always, don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave your thoughts on the questions discussed in the comments below. Without further ado, please enjoy the following 55-minute conversation.
So I would be interested to know about how you got into philosophy and sort of what your journey in academia has been since then.
Yeah, that's a great question. I started out as an undergraduate interested in healthcare and psychology. I really wanted to be like a marriage and family therapist. Um, and in my first semester at university, I was taking a neuroscience class, and I had this burning question for the professor. Um, do you think that the mind is like the brain, is the same thing as the brain, or is the mind separate from the brain? And my professor was so kind and generous to my question. And I was like, neuroscientists generally think that the mind just is the brain, but you should go read some work by these philosophers and Christoph Koch to try to explore this question further. And I just realized the more that I studied psychology, the more that I was really interested in these kinds of philosophical questions and also in how science can contribute to answering them. Um, and so by the end of my undergraduate degree in psychology, I was taking more and more philosophy classes and just learned that's really where my interest lies. So I pursued a master's in philosophy after that.
Yeah, very cool. I know a lot of our guests have been, scholars of philosophy of like X or anything, and they often say that they've studied both philosophy and the sort of science or whatever other aspect. So I was interested to know what your experience has been at the intersection of these two. Like, I guess, could you talk about what questions philosophy you think has to answer and what questions science has to answer, and sort of what the intersection of applying both of those has led you to explore in your work?
Well, that is such a great question. I've been thinking a lot about this lately because there's a style of doing philosophy in which you can start from any kind of claim and then deduce logically what would follow from that. And you can learn things that way. Um, but learning things scientifically is a little bit different because what you're starting off with is like a question you want to know about the world where you need to make some observations about the world. And philosophy doesn't necessitate that. Sometimes um, you can start off with an idea and just follow it and see where it leads. Um, Whereas science seems to require that you actually go to the world and make some observations or do some experiments. And so it's like different ways of answering questions. Um, and so there's like some philosophical questions you can try to tease apart and answer scientifically, I think. And so there's a way in which the divide isn't very clear. And definitely you can't do science without philosophy, and philosophy is super supported by science. I think philosophical claims are enriched by appealing to science. Um, so yeah, I don't know if that answers your question completely, but as a kind of vague pass, I think that that's how they're related. Yeah.
Definitely. And what is, I guess, you've sort of implicitly answered if philosophy is asking, more generic questions about not necessarily tied to the world, and science is more or less looking at material phenomena. What exactly does philosophy of neuroscience entail, I guess? Like, what sort of questions does that concern itself with?
Great. I think the easiest way to answer this question is to contrast it with two other very similar kinds of projects you might have. So, there's a general field of neurophilosophy, which is what I was kind of talking about, where philosophers might draw on neuroscience to answer questions about the mind or about about humans. And so the direction is like reading a bunch of neuroscience work or understanding the neuroscience to understand what kind of claims you can make about us. Um, there's also philosophy in neuroscience, which is kind of a newer conception, but there's there's a specific role for philosophers where they can be in neuroscience labs and kind of observe and like ask questions of the work or make philosophical contributions to the science itself. So this is like hands-on philosophy. And then philosophy of neuroscience is a branch of philosophy of science. So the kinds of questions philosophers are asking is what kind of claims are scientists making about the brain? How do they go about studying the brain? Um, and then questions about like the nature of the knowledge that we get from doing the kinds of neuroscience that neuroscientists do. So using their tools, the tools at their disposal, what can we say about how the brain, does things like let's have language, or remember things, or um, things like this. So um, it's really like a higher perspective on the science and what we should make of how it does what it does.
Sure.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, so in that sense, it's sort of like an epistemological take on what the field of neuroscience is like structured in. I would is am I
exactly.
understanding? Understood. Okay.
That's a
So
great way of putting it, yeah.
yeah, so I guess what insight? How does those like if you have a question about the knowledge you gain from neuroscience or sort of an exploration of what neuroscience as a field contributes, how does that translate to maybe um, how neuroscience research in the future is like conducted, I guess. Like I'm interested in knowing how the feedback from philosophy plays a role in the continuation of science, I guess.
So, I think philosophers want the world to be a lot bigger than it really is. And part of that is just that sometimes philosophers are just interested in different kinds of questions. So I'm going to be really interested in what the brain is like really doing. Like, how is it really processing? How does the mind really realize there? And sometimes neuroscientists just want to know, like, what is this circuit and what is this circuit doing? Or like, um, can we measure the firing rates of neurons and map that to something in the world? Um, so these very particular questions don't always overlap. So philosophers might try to, what's the way to put this, like project their interests onto the neuroscience. And so the work that they're doing might not always be that relevant for neuroscientists. It might not always be that helpful. But some work that philosophers do really is. So there's some work that's like trying to clear up concepts or trying to clear up some of the epistemological issues. And I think some of that does have uptake. So I've seen neuroscientists reference various works by philosophers, in particular from being careful for how words are used, and what evidence is actually bearing on those concepts. So it does happen, that that there's like uptake for philosophy and neuroscience. Um, but it's for questions that philosophers work on that neuroscientists are interested in. So it's a very specialized bit of it. Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean that sort of leads me to my next question about what sort of questions you're interested in and what you have been working on. I've tried to, in preparation for this, I've tried to read a little bit about what you do, and I think I've gleaned a little bit here and there. But I think the best way of approaching this is asking you to introduce a little about what you work on.
Thanks. Yeah. So I'm interested. There's a lot of questions I'm interested in: philosophy of science and mind and neuroscience, cognitive science generally. But the research I've been doing lately is, one project neuroscientists have, especially cognitive neuroscientists or computational neuroscientists, is trying to parse out bits of the brain and figure out what those bits are doing. And so that requires a number of things. It requires that you parse out the brain in the right way, and that you're doing it according to the right features. It also requires that you kind of have a good basis for determining what it is that those parts are doing. Um, and so I think that there's just a lot that remains unknown about the brain, and trying to answer questions like this or trying to parse out the brain in the right way. Um, but I also, I'm interested in how these might be in principle issues, meaning that like it's not just we don't know enough, but the kinds of questions we're asking actually can't be answered in the way that we want to answer them. Um, and so ways of so this kind of looks like if we were to scope out like a reductionism question, like can we localize bits of the mind to bits of the brain? Is like the broader um the one of the broader issues. But then also, um, there's like issues in biology about like what parts are important. So generally, that's like those are the issues that I'm thinking about a lot lately.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to unpack there, but I think I want to begin with sort of the first concept you gave about mapping or understanding what different parts of the brain can represent, right? And sort of what those specific patterns have to do in relation to the mind or sort of something like that. So could you sort of go a little more in depth on understanding how does that happen? And then also what does that sort of implicate and how is that maybe different from the scientific way of approaching understanding the brain?
Okay, great. It might be helpful to um 'cause you used the word represent, and I think you didn't like, it was I wanted to say that was a good word to use. I think people worry about using the word represent sometimes, but, yeah, we're interested in how the brain represents, and there's a bunch of different ways you can understand that kind of claim. So you can think that, the brain represents because the mind's representing. So if I take, like, a picture of my house, then we could say the photograph represents my house, and we think that the mind is in some way really like this. The representational theory of mind is like really successful in explaining like, well, I'm representing the world when I think about the world or when I talk about the world. And so one way to think about what the brain's doing is that it is what's called the vehicle for those representations. So it is what bears the content, what it bears the like so if I'm having a thought about my house, it's what bears that thought about the house. Um and so when we're if we're answering questions like that, then parsing out the brain is looking for what it is that's making me able to think about houses. Um, and so that's like the richest sense we could talk about representations in the brain. But there's also like these looser ways in talking about it. And where really just to say that something's representing is to say like it's doing something. So this populations of neurons here is just like um it's tracking some feature of the world, but not in this robust sense. It's not being, the organism or the human isn't thinking about it right now. But maybe these populations of neurons is tracking like the location of my arm or the position of my head in certain ways. And neuroscientists are very interested in understanding those kinds of functional roles, but it's not everyone wants to call them representations. So I say this just to say that in thinking about parsing out what the brain does and in talking about representational terms, I'm interested in both senses. So I think there's this fundamental question about just figuring out what things in the brain do. And then sometimes that's used to try to answer questions about mental representations, which is, okay, well, parts of the brain seem to help us have mental phenomena or seem to allow us to speak or think about things. Um, and I'm losing track of your original question, but I wanted to I wanted to clarify that, but would you mind asking your question again?
Yeah, if I remember correctly, I was sort of interested in understanding um, wait, yeah, how you go about understanding, what specific like, I'm just interested in understanding the process, I guess, of, asking these questions. Is it about, you like, tackling a certain part of the brain, or is it, like, a certain, phenomena that occurs on, like, a interpersonal level? Like, how do you go about asking these questions, I guess, and then how do you go about unpacking, um, w the representation of the brain, I guess, where that might occur, if that makes
No,
any
that's great.
sense?
No, thank you. And so now I wanted to make the clarification because I guess depending on what I'm thinking about at the time is going to depend on how I answer the question. But if I'm just wondering how neuroscientists go about parsing out the brain and whether or not they're doing it in a way that seems it's always worthwhile, but maybe whether or not they're doing it in such a way that I can answer the questions of representations, I go and read a ton of neuroscience articles. Um, and try to understand the particular techniques that they're using. So, in my master's, I did this for what is called optogenetics research. So, this is like a very cool technique where researchers genetically modify neurons so that they can be activated when you shine light on them. And this is in mice usually, but other kinds of animals as well. So there'll be like a light implanted in the skull. And when the light shines, these neurons fire, and the mouse can do various things based on that. So if you're shining light in the motor cortex, for example, the mouse might run around in circles. Um, Or I saw a video once of I think they're shredding it in the hypothalamus, and the mouse engages in eating behavior whenever the light's on. And so I'm thinking about, okay, well, the researchers have this technique, and with it, they're
Hmm.
able to probe these populations of neurons and see what happens on the basis of that kind of intervention. Um, and so the kinds of questions that I might ask is like whether this supports a reductionism of like, okay, well, does the hypothalamus, is that just the representation of eating? That seems too simple, but what kind of claims might be justified with this technique? So I go read all the articles, try to understand the technique. And if I find patient neuroscientists, which I generally do, they're usually very nice. I can ask them a bunch of questions about it and exactly how their technique works. So I learned a bunch of the neuroscience and then try to use that to answer the questions I have about the science.
Sure.
Um, and then for the more robust question about like, is the brain, are bits of the brain realizing bits of mind? I will also need to go look at some of the philosophical accounts and try to understand, well, what would that mean? And then can neuroscience answer questions given those accounts? And so there's
Yeah.
variation in how to answer that question.
Yeah, so that definitely clarifies that. I just wanted to say I think that makes a lot of sense. And so now I'm interested in this concept of reductionism, and I think you mentioned something about. So could you just briefly talk a little bit about what you exactly meant in that context, and uh, yeah, I guess why it's necessarily reductionist to maybe say the hypothalamus is, for example, responsible for eating behaviors or something along those lines. What exactly did you mean by that?
No, great. And people mean all sorts of different things with it. I meant it in a general sense, but it's interesting. There's debates about what it would mean to say that. Well, because it's a reductionist project at all to say that the mind is in the brain. That the mind, because you're reducing the mind to this physical structure, and a lot of people are committed to this kind of claim that, well, the brain surely has some role in realizing or producing our mental life. And then there's various questions about how it does so, and that's where you get these different reductionist accounts where um, it might be that there's the mind is supervenient on the brain, or um, there are these types of mental thoughts that are related to types of structures in the brain. Um, but in the project that I was doing for a master's, this is a very particular claim about how neuroscience reduces psychological phenomena. So there's competing accounts where, let's use memory as an example. I think memory is really intuitive for reductionism in the brain. Um, the thought is that if I'm remembering my eighth grade birthday party or something like this, for me to be able to remember that, it seems that the information needs to be stored in the brain for me to be able to retrieve it at a later time. And then, of course, how it does this is an open question. Um, but apart from reductions of memory or mental phenomena to the brain, there's reductions in neuroscience itself. So you might think, well, there's going to be all these structures in the brain that relate to my remembering my eighth grade birthday party. Um, and so scientists might try to look at these bigger structures in the brain to try to make sense of that. But there's accounts that want to say, like, actually, you could just look at cells and molecules in the brain to try to understand how memory is stored. And so that's a different kind of reduction where you're looking at smaller and smaller bits to try to, because the reason why you might do that is you might think that's where the causes are. The causal relations that are allowing me to retrieve memory or engage in some kind of behavior are at the cellular and molecular level. And so that's the kind of reduction that I was thinking about where um, in these studies of memory using optogenetics research, for example, they're intervening on cells. They're intervening on populations of cells. And so maybe memory can be reduced all the way down to that really low level in the brain. Um, and so that's kind of the reductionism I had in mind. But the other kind of reductionism is in the background too, where we're thinking about, is the mental phenomena really in the brain? Yeah.
I see. Yeah, so I guess implicitly, is it your intuition that uh, that sort of mapping of memories being caused, I guess, causally related to certain cells or certain interactions on the molecular level? I guess where else, where do you posit seeing memories being represented external to that? Where do you think reductionism loses something fundamental about um, these phenomena and how these occur?
Well, that's a great question. Um, there's a couple different ways where I think reduction of cells and molecules isn't quite get it right, and that's the other areas of the brain are for sure involved, and there's these emergent processes. Um, but also there's these really interesting accounts of like extended cognition, where it's the 4E tradition, extended, embodied. I can never remember all the E's, so I'm actually just not gonna try here. But the thought is that our memory is stored externally. Stored externally to us. So might make a little note to myself on a Post-it and store it somewhere. Um, and that seems to play the exact same functional role that memory does in my brain. Um, and so the idea is that actually memory is external to us in a lot of ways. And that would be super anti-reductionist to memory
Hmm.
stored in the brain. Um, yeah, so I I'm not sure what to make of those kinds of accounts. I think there's something right to the fact that that's playing the same role as memory does in my brain, at least by stipulation. Um, but uh, but of course, I am interested in. I'm interested in how the brain does that. So when I'm writing like a Post-it note, saying like, remember to get milk at the grocery store, it's like it's very obvious to us how that information is like stored and continues through time. It's not obvious how that happens in the brain. Where what is it storing the information, and how it's being recalled later. Um, and so that's where I think like the reductions that looks really helpful, but whether or not it's actually reduced memory is actually reduced to the brain in that way, not sure. Yeah, I'm not sure. What do you think? Do you have an opinion on this?
Um, well, I'm sort of just being introduced to these concepts, but I think it seems like there's different definitions of what memory might entail,
Hmm.
in my opinion. Like, is it true that like the brain holds, well, like there's a like I guess there's the fact that you're holding information external to the brain, which is like certainly true as you mentioned. You can write it down, or you can, yeah, you can write it down. You can tell somebody else or something like that. But at the end of the day, there's also a different type of memory, which is like sort of knowledge that you hold within the brain. And so I'm curious to understand, like, is there a fundamental difference between these two? And at the same time, can't memory still be like traced to the individual cells in the brain? Like, uh, those do seem to like there seems to be a difference that you're making between causal relationships in memory and also sort of like more subjective ways of recalling memory. And I'm interested to know like how you might go about categorizing these different um, like ways, I guess, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so are you thinking like, okay, so my recalling the memory, like me like thinking about my 8th grade birthday party. I actually don't remember my 8th grade birthday party. I'm sure it was really cool. um, but like me like subjectively remembering it, and how that might be different than the fact that there's some processes in my brain that allow me to subjectively remember it.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, this is a great the relation between the 2 is, like, not obvious, especially because there's these issues about false memory where, there's, these studies by Elizabeth Loftus and others, that showed that you could be quite suggestive with people and create what people think are memories, but they're really not true. But they have the feeling subjectively of a memory, like it's familiar, um, and it's being recalled like a memory. And so the case is like being lost in a shopping mall or something like this, where the researchers just suggested over time these details, and the participants came to remember being lost in a shopping mall.
Hmm.
Um, and so they have a subjective experience, but um, it seems like that might be realized in the brain the same way as another kind of memory would be, like a more natural memory.
Hmm.
Um, and so, but trying to understand how that might occur is not obvious. And the reason why is because there's going to be all these changes in the brain that are occurring after, you know, after the episode, after the thing occurred, or after I learned the fact or event, um, and later recall. And if I want to understand storage, I might have to account for the fact that our memories are volatile. we misremember things often. We get suggestions and create these false memories. And so trying to understand how, like, what the memory is of is going to be quite difficult given all these changes that do occur in our remembering. Um, and so there's these huge differences between subjective remembering and a biological story we might tell. But it's not even clear how we can get these levels to match necessarily. It seems like the changes might explain the changes in the memory subjectively, but it's not obvious that that's the case, or how we could go about determining it. So just say there's tons of open questions here um, about memory. I think about memory all the time. I like memory a lot.
Yeah, so I'm curious, has a lot of your work been about like the subjective experience of memory, or has there been sort of other projects you're interested in that you can maybe share with us today?
Yeah, I have not. Okay, so I've thought a lot about the subjective experiencing of memory, but not like professionally, not in my work. But I actually keep like this little journal to note down like times when I find out I had a false memory. Um, in particular, I have like other kinds of memory notes in there too. But I found out that like a really good test for having a false memory is like movies from childhood where you'll remember certain details of them. I usually, like, have the words right, but then the imagery is wrong. Like, and not just the colors, it'll just, like, completely have the imagery. I thought it happened a different way. Like, I first realized this with the movie Cloudy with a Chance of Meatballs. I just remembered a scene completely differently than it actually occurs. And so I make notes about this, and I'm really interested in whether there's, like, a pattern to, like, what is remembered correctly and what's not remembered correctly. Um there's also research, like, on what are called flashbulb memories where, um, if we have, like, a traumatic experience or traumatic event, it's a very vivid memory to us. But there's research showing that's actually not always accurate. So we think if it's more vivid, I'm remembering it more accurately, and that's also not true, or not necessarily. Um, and so understanding these kinds of subjective it's telling for why some details get lost or become inaccurate. Um, so yeah, so I think about the subjective experience quite a bit, but in my academic work, I mostly focus on neuroscientific study of it. And that might look at those studies might be interested in the subjective experience, but usually they're measuring behavior or some report about the memory, and so it sometimes is dissociated in really interesting ways.
Yeah, so I'm actually really interested in the first half about like your sort of personal experience regarding this. I just want to understand like how you came about doing this, I guess, and then also if you've had any sort of takeaways from your whole experience with this sort of personal project that you have.
Yeah, so I started doing it with the Cloudy with a Chance of Meatballs because it was a scene. It's gonna be so silly to say out loud. Okay, there's a scene in the movie where the main guy, Fleck? I don't remember his name. Dang it. But he on the phone is like, "I'll meet you in the forest." In the like, um imagery I have for that scene, he's, like, literally running into the forest while this happens, and I was rewatching the movie, and he's not, he's, like, in a lab with his monkey. Oh, it's gonna be so funny if I also have this wrong, like, now that I'm remembering it again. Pretty sure he's in the lab with the monkey, and I was like, "That is so weird that, um, the imagery of my original imagery of the scene is, like, kind of fuzzy too, and it's, like, not quite how the cartoon is." Just and I was just like, "I wanna start noting these because these are, like" what's helpful with movies, I could have false memories about my past where I'm relying on other friends' testimony, like, other friends like, "No, this happened, it didn't happen that way." And it's like, well, they could be wrong too. Movie is a record, so, like, I have the evidence that shows that I was falsely remembering it. But what I found out is that usually I have the quotes right. Like, I remember the words fine, but it's the imagery that I get wrong. Um, and so, at least most of the time, I think sometimes some of the event structures are a little off too. But it's led me to think that okay, so you can dissociate in memory like memories of words or facts and memories of events, where you have um like memories in your personal past. And there's thought that these are stored differently, and there's a lot of psychological and neuroscientific evidence for this. And so what that tells me is that, okay, well, I'm a little more successful at semantic remembering, which is like what happened and, what the character said, rather than like this imagery notion, which is like what people tend to get wrong with episodic remembering. Um, so that's one pattern. I've haven't had a lot of opportunity to do a lot of this personal project. Mostly because I haven't had a lot of time to rewatch movies, but yeah, I don't know. I want to ask you if you have had experiences of false memories or if anything comes to mind that resonates with you.
Yeah, I mean, I'm trying to think. There's also I've heard about the there's the Mandela effect. I'm not sure if that's related
Yeah.
regarding like misremembering certain characteristics of like famous like icons. But I do remember actually in like a lot of we watched a lot of TV shows and sometimes um maybe I don't misremember, but I feel like I watched it 100 times and I just forget that there's like a certain piece of dialogue or a certain scene. And I always think that like, is this like a different version that I'm watching or like, is this like a different editor? Like, so I'm maybe that's like a part of that about there's sort of an unexpected shock about maybe seeing it sort of for the first time, it seems like, even though you may have seen it a lot.
No, that okay, that's really interesting. The Mandela effect is interesting because it's like it's not just you, it's like everyone's remembering it wrong. But it's the
Yeah.
same experience with like um I remember rewatching recently Honey, I Shrunk the Kids. And I remember as a little kid, that movie was so good, and it was so, like, wild and fascinating, and I was watching it, and I'm just like, "This is completely different than what I remember from, from
Yeah.
before." And not just, like, factual details, it's just, yeah, I felt like I was watching it for the very first time. And, uh and I misremembered whole bits of it. Um, but yeah, it's interesting how we can misremember things in the same exact way too, where, like, I know one of them is, like, the Berenstain Bears, or it's spelled, like, Berenstain. But we remember it Berenstain. It's like, well, probably we just weren't great at spelling as little kids or something, and that's why we misremember it. Berenstain seemed more intuitive or something like this.
Yeah,
Um, but yeah, no, those kinds of areas in remembering are fascinating. Um,
of course.
and it'd be cool to
Definitely.
uncover some reasons for why that occurs. Yeah.
Yeah, have you I guess, this is sort of a tangent, but I guess you mentioned that you look a lot in work in a lot in the neuroscience literature, and you've read a lot about that. So, have you come across research regarding, this phenomena of, like, misremembering or, remembering something, in a different way? Like, is that studied, and sort of what has been your take on that literature, if it has?
Yeah, so it's for sure studied in cognitive science. In neuroscience, I it's hard to say because um I think what's often the case, and I might have just not be exposed to the research where they're actually doing this, but what's often the case is that they'll like track a population of neurons that they think is a memory or is storing a memory over time and see it change in like the population of neurons, like the activities are changing, but also different populations of neurons seem to be storing the memory. And the neuroscientists think, okay, this is why our memories get vague, why we lose detail, and why, like, a week later, I remember less, and why I might forget. Um, and so they're, like, very interested in explaining the misremembering at this level of, like, populations of neurons. Um, but I'm because those kinds of studies occur in animals, and it's kinda hard to ask the
Mm.
animals, like, "Hey, what do you remember?" They try to do this behaviorally, so there's ways to get around it, but it creates difficulties trying to understand what exactly is happening, neurologically with remembering. Um, so, um, I'm sure people are asking these questions and they're interested in them, but how to answer them is the tricky part, and how to figure out what exactly is going on.
Yeah. I mean, it's kind of interesting how, like, a lot of like the science seems to hinge around a very common everyday phenomena that we sort of don't think twice about, but there's a lot of literature, there's a lot of people out there that are very interested in studying that. I mean, that's sort of the deal with a lot of science, a lot of philosophy in general, but every time I'm reminded of it, I'm like always impressed and amazed by how complex our world and our entire environment is. So
Yeah.
I just wanted to, obviously we spent quite a lot of time on this concept of memories, and I just wanted to introduce one more thing I remember reading about, which was something related to the indeterminacy problem. I think something along those
Um,
lines. So I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit about what that means and if that sort of ties into our previous discussion.
oh yeah, absolutely it does. Um, so a helpful way to introduce this issue is to talk about what's called content indeterminacy. So earlier I talked about how our mind seemed to represent the world. I could think about my childhood home. I could think about what I had for breakfast this morning. Um, and when we want to explain the fact that our mind can do this, um, we want to explain what's a good way to put this. So there's alternatives to representing the world where it's just like we're just like perceiving the world, or um we're just like engaging with the world directly. And what we get when we're saying we're representing the world is it kind of explains how we get things wrong sometimes. So like when you I'm sure you know this phenomenon where if you put a stick in water, it appears to be bent. Um and that's something we can explain with the representational theory of mind. It's just like, okay, well, I'm representing the stick as bent, even though we know it's not actually water doesn't bend the stick when it gets in water.
Hmm.
Um so if we have an account of representation, we want to be able to say that, okay, well, we get things wrong sometimes. There's a content, and then there's like content that's like not true to the world. So the content determinacy arises in trying to figure out what the content is. So the like classic example is a toad catching flies. And so he has this tongue lashing mechanism that gets the flies, and we think he's representing the object out there that he's catching with his tongue. But what is he representing is not clear. He could be representing flies, or he could be representing small moving black dots, or he could be representing frog food. And so there's this like issue in determining what the content is, and it matters because we want to be able to explain if he gets it wrong. If for some reason he catches a droner bee or something like this, was he misrepresenting that bee as a fly or not? And there's like not really a principled basis for some of these questions. Um, as another example, let's say that I'm like in a field at night and I see what I think is a horse. Um, and really it's like just like a skinny cow or something like this. You might think like, okay, well, that area of the brain, now we're kind of moving to the brain, but that area of the brain functions to represent horses, and it just like malfunctioned when I saw the cow or something like this. Or you could think, oh, well, actually functioned to track cows or horses. And so there's like really no basis on which we can be like, no, that was the content. And so it's kind of this big problem in representational theory is trying to determine what the content is. It's called the content indeterminacy problem. What's the content? Um, I think that that problem is just it exists in neuroscience as well. I have a paper on this, where it's trying to figure out when you're looking at an area of the brain or some kind of structure, a pattern of activity, what is it representing? There's usually various different options that researchers have that they could use that are all explanatory adequate for what they want to explain. So
Mm.
they all are fitting. But there's also what I think is a vehicle indeterminacy problem. So earlier I talked about like the structures or patterns of activity in the brain that bear content. Those are called vehicles. And it's really just neuroscientists don't know what it is in the brain that bears content. There's some ideas like how neurons fire or how fast they fire or these projections of neurons between different areas of the brain. There's all these candidates. For what could be bearing content, but we don't know. And I think it's a more radical problem of um, trying to understand what in the brain could bear content. It's not straightforward how we can answer a question like that. Um, so yeah, so the indeterminacy is just like um, uh, it's at least that we don't know
Mm.
kind of indeterminacy. We're not sure. But it could be also more in principle or metaphysical. I'm not sure what to think about the vehicle one yet, but I know that some people think that the content determinacy problem is a metaphysical one, um, where there is just no determinate content of our representations. It seems kind of counterintuitive because when I'm thinking
Sure.
about my childhood home, it's like, well, that's my childhood home I'm thinking of. It seems pretty obvious. But um, but there's some really good reason to think that it's not determinate. So yeah, so those are the indeterminacy issues that arise. Yeah.
Very cool. I think so. Just to recap, if I understand correctly, there's sort of two um, uncertainties regarding how content is relayed, i.e., through like action potentials between synapses or whatever, and then also there's the question of what like sort of holds this content within like the physical structure of the brain. And I'm interested to know like what questions, or I guess you mentioned that you've done some research, written some papers on this. So what exactly have you thought about, and what have you worked on regarding these two issues, I guess?
Yeah. So okay. One for the vehicle indeterminacy paper, my thought is really just challenging some philosophers' ideas that um really the neuroscientists have it figured out, but also that they um, have made good progress towards figuring it out. This is not to say this is one of those claims where this is what philosophers want out of neuroscientists, not what neuroscientists are looking for. But we want to be able to understand, yeah, are those bits of the brain vehicles for our mental phenomena?
Hmm.
Um, and my argument is really just against these like appeals to neuroscience on the basis that we don't know what it is that is bearing content. But the way that I show this is by appealing to different principles of scientific realism. And so just in brief, you might think that something we discover in science is real because we know all of its properties. We know the kinds of relations it could stand in. We're able to observe it. We're able to use it to do all these various things. We just know everything about it. And so we think it's real. And we just don't have that kind of information for the brain. But it's reasonable. We're still, science is in progress. We're still working on it. And so one thought is, okay, well, we kind of think that there's vehicles in the brain, those vehicles are real. If we're able to access it or look at it or detect it with various different tools, various different experimental paradigms, various different labs. Um, and I think this is where kind of a more difficult issue arises is it's not quite clear what it would mean to like show that this population of neurons, these action potentials in this area, um, were accessed with different tools in different brains in other kinds of systems. Um, what that re-identifiability amounts to isn't really clear, and I think it just requires a theory telling us, well, okay, this is what's important. These are the details that matter in the brain for understanding mental phenomena or cognitive phenomena generally. And then trying to figure out what it means to say, like, okay, we found the population of neurons again. That population of neurons is really the memory of her 8th grade birthday party. And we found another population of neurons that also is a vehicle for the 8th grade birthday party. Um, it's a really difficult issue trying to get that kind of, it's called a robust analysis off the ground, where we're showing that we have robust evidence that or we've robustly detected that structure as a vehicle, um, where it could be actually synaptic connections in the population of neurons, or it could be a broader population, or actually just a little bit of that population. It could be molecules, or it could be genes. There's all sorts of different things in the brain that could be doing the work. Um, and so this is where the indeterminacy is just, it's currently, we don't know, but I'm currently thinking about whether it's a more in principle issue in neuroscience, with trying to determine
Very
what it is
interesting.
in the brain. Yeah. Yeah.
Very interesting. I mean, uh, it sort of speaks to the. I mean, yeah, these are just sort of questions that I don't think I've ever really thought about, and I don't think that are very honestly explored even in sort of mainstream philosophy. But again, maybe I'm misreading a lot of these. But have you looked into the other problem regarding like the vehicle indeterminacy problem? Have you had any thoughts regarding that question as well?
Yeah. So that's um that's primarily the problem with identifying the bits in the brain. But the corollary, I think, is the content indeterminacy problem, which is trying to understand what those bits of the brain are doing when we parse them out. And so I've been thinking about the vehicle indeterminacy problem a lot. It's like the topic of my dissertation. Um, and I've applied it to memory and trying to understand like what in the brain is storing our memories, what structures or what patterns. Um, and then I'm actually currently trying to apply it to AI and trying to figure out like, okay, if we have a system where we know the code, we know the inputs, outputs, generally, or we know the architecture, can we can we figure out what the content is and what's bearing the content? And so that's where I'm more recently
Mhm.
thinking about it in my research.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think it also shows the sort of interdisciplinary application of a lot of these questions, and also obviously ties to like very topical questions of does AI have consciousness? Is it sentient, etc.
Yeah.
So I'm interested to know learn a little bit more about what you've thought about regarding AI. Sort of, ha do you think it's different from how the sort of traditional questions regarding the mind and the brain, or is it sort of the same sort of questions that apply, or is it somehow different in some way? Yeah.
This is fascinating. I what I think so uh I don't have good thoughts on AI in particular. And the reason why is honestly just because I see it as analogous to kinds of skepticisms and questions we have about the brain. And so what I mean
Hmm.
by this is like, okay, if you don't think that the brain is representing, if you don't think that representations happen at the in neurological level, it's because you think that it's just like this causal relay where you get input to the system, a bunch of causal molecular soup happens is complex and then output. And like we're just trying to parse out the causal bits, but there's no actual representations there. We might be using the representations to figure out what the causal bits are doing, but it's just causes. It's just physics. There's no representations. There's nothing's about something in the brain. Um and I think that that's kind of the kind of skepticism you get with animal cognition, where you're looking at other animals and like, well, yeah, I could explain this as just like light rays hitting a retina and then a bunch of neurons firing and then behavioral output without any cognition there. Um, and then of course people in supporting medical cognition want to provide arguments like, no, well, it's actually better to explain it with cognition. And that's exactly where we are with AI. So I have a friend who does some work on this. Nina Van Ray Duke University, um, where it's the kinds of frameworks that we've been applying to animal research this whole time are kind of being applied to AI now. Where, well, no, the argument is that these are just mathematical transformations over vectors, and so it's providing some output, and we're interpreting it a certain way, but it's not
Sure.
really thinking. It's not really representational. But I think there might still be some use, to treating it as a representational system in the same way that, like, even if the brain isn't representational, it still might be useful. We still might be able to use it to figure out what the brain's up to. And so I think just in that sense, it's, like, useful, but I don't know if it really is. Like, yeah, at bottom, yeah, it's just, transform architecture, computing vectors, and maybe that's all the brain is too.
Yeah.
Who knows?
Exactly. Yeah.
So yeah. Yeah. Um,
Yeah. I mean, this is sort of like it seems like the crux of um, the sort of comparison that's often drawn between our brain and AI models. Oh, there's like one half that says no, it's just like math, and there's an input, it's an output. There's like a mathematical function involved, so you can't really describe consciousness. But I've always thought that maybe that's sort of what our brain is doing as well, right? Like there's sort of physical reactions that are happening between calcium ions hitting phosphate ions or whatever, and sort of we can see the world or we can feel emotion to my dog or whatever. And so it seems like there needs to be more rigorous explanation of why that can be ascribed something different, but maybe AI that seemingly has similar processes on a surface level is not necessarily given the same amount of subjective experience, at least from what I've seen and from what I've heard. Um,
yeah.
so
No,
yeah,
getting at
I'm
the subjective experience is hard. I buy that it's a hard problem. I'm I'm all for that. Yeah.
yeah. I mean, obviously you mentioned you're not you're may not be exactly like well versed in sort of the field of AI ethics or whatever, but I'm curious to know how you if you have any other views regarding the development of AI and what it means for maybe your work in the mind and the brain. Yeah, I'm curious to see what other interactions you've thought about.
Yeah, this is it has such an interesting topic right now. It's multifaceted because there's like worries about the capacities that AI can have in the future and whether we should give them those kinds of capacities. I'm not sure how to think about those questions now just because I I think what AI can do now is really, really it's impressive. It's fascinating. But I think a lot of the worries are like if AI gets way more powerful than it is now. And so I'm not sure how to think about those questions. Um but as far as, like, what AI is capable now, there's all sorts of interesting issues with using it as, AI companions, and so using it, in as a kind of replacement for human-human interactions, which seems harmless in a lot of ways, and I think it has been there's cases where it's been incredibly useful, but just we're not sure yet how it impacts, our relationships with other people, um also relying on it for, if you're a student and you have an essay due in an hour, it's really tempting to just have a large language model write the essay real quick. And so there's like, ethical issues as like as a teacher, like am I responsible or should I set up constraints to keep students from being tempted to do that so that they're able to learn? Um, and I think, yeah, I think that it's a tool we should figure out how to use responsibly and there's a lot to be done with thinking about in AI ethics. Um, but yeah, you're right. I'm not sure. I don't have any like general ethical claims other than like there's like things that we should be cautious of for sure in interacting with and using AI. Just because we're not sure what the consequences are, and we have the power to shape society in certain ways, and so we should take that seriously. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, definitely, it does seem like we're entering a different age, and it seems necessary to treat it as such. And it's exactly why input from philosophers like yourself and other academics seems so important to me, and sort of the reason why it's part of the reason, at least, why this podcast seems relevant to me. So it's a bit of a cliffhanger that I want to like sort of segue off of this topic, but because I find it quite interesting as well. But the last sort of topic I wanted to talk about is the youth. Obviously, this podcast is meant for young people, so I was just wondering if you have any advice for young people interested in the topics you study and how they should maybe go about entering the field if they want to.
Yeah. So okay. Um, Yeah, this is a good question because there's so many different ways to get into philosophy, to get into academia. Um, and like, so I think the most important thing is just knowing that that's something that you're interested in. And I think finding out you're interested is just kind of doing it and talking with people who do it. And like kind of
Hmm.
I think what you're doing now is perfect for this, honestly. Um, but even just like, even as a high school student, going to a college campus and asking a professor if you can show up at their office hours and just talk with them about philosophical issues you're interested in, or you could talk to, college students or graduate students. Um, and, um, yeah, and just chatting with them. I think one of the most rewarding things about doing philosophy is talking with people one on one. Um, I very much enjoy reading and writing philosophy as well, but it's really cool to develop views with other people. And it's also just a foot in the door. So if you know people who are doing things that you like doing, they're gonna have an eye open for opportunities where you can do that work or you can, join a program or eventually try to do it as a career if that's something you're interested in. Um so yeah, my advice is to get connected with people. And then like there's like yeah, and there's like certain reading lists on the internet that can tell you like, ways to get like your basis. But if you take college classes, then you'll get the introductory basis as well. So I think it's probably like the next step is just to talk to people and yeah, and then figure out what your interests are. I think that's really important too. Yeah.
Yeah, something I've realized, again, I think I mentioned at the beginning about from scholars that work in like the philosophy of X sort of interdisciplinary field is that a lot of them have told me that it's good to um, both study the second half of that phrase and then also study philosophy concurrently. So if somebody's interested in philosophy of computer science, they should, have a basis in computer science and then also learn about the more formal philosophy and looking at how those overlap. So I always think it's interesting to reiterate the sort of connection between science and philosophy, and I think that's sort of what we opened with as well. So I think
Yeah.
that's a good closing message. Yeah, so thank you very much. Obviously, we're almost nearing up on our time, so I won't take any more. And I think we can wrap up the episode here. I definitely enjoyed this a lot. It was a very interesting and engaging conversation, and I'm sure our audience did as well.
Thank you so much. It was great. Thanks for inviting me.